because his election was such an extraordinary event in our history, in the history of my country. It was unthinkable that a state like North Carolina, which had been a slave state, which resisted civil rights, or Virginia, the same thing, would actually vote for an African-American president. It was unthinkable. I mean, 40 years ago, you know, I was working in the South when the idea, that was so far beyond anybody's conception of possibility. You know, anybody that raised it would have been taken as a fool. Yet, 40 years later, it happened. Now, so, you know, and there were several factors. There was a lot of struggle involved. There was a lot of people, there was a lot of sacrifice involved. There was generational change, which is very, very important dynamic of the possibilities of change. There was learning. There was people coming to the conclusions that in order to be the kind of people that we claimed we wanted to be, we had to change some ways of action. There was a lot of fighting about it too. I mean, in other words, it was not like just all of a sudden the heavens opened and it was true. But it did happen. So I'm of the conviction that the only way you get answers to these questions is by engaging with them. In other words, it's by engaging with it. And it's going with as open a heart, as strong a heart as you can, to engage others in the process of working at it. And you know, and this isn't not some sort of just idealistic, wonderful things happen. I mean, it takes a lot of risk, effort, and reverses, and going backwards 2 steps, and then maybe you go forward 3, you know. But I'm much more hopeful about the prospects of change simply based on what I've seen in my own lifetime. And that's about the best evidence I can offer. Thank you.
Professor, you said you were there to you in school.
Wait, it's not you. Wait a second. I need to find the person. Who's the person with the mic?
It's me here.
Where is he? Way in the back?
Yeah.
All right. Oh, I see you. All right. Okay. Thank you.
I'm sorry. You said in your third year in school, undergrad school, you left school and you traveled away to work with civil organization. My question is, you volunteered there. How do you manage your personal expenses? Did you get a salary?
There's a practical man. There's a practical question. Well, you know, I was, let's see, I was 20 at the time, and people that volunteered to work in the civil rights movement got room and board and $10 a week. That was how we did it. I mean, now I didn't have a family to support. I was, you know, a young person at the time. We found the communities we were working with often supported us, provided us with food and housing and what we needed. But I have to say, the farm workers that I worked with was a volunteer, it was a full-time volunteer organization. In other words, it was people committing their effort. And this included families, single people, working for rent and gas and a car, if needed, in order to make the movement happen. And I guess what I think was that we were capitalizing the movement or the need for change with our own labor and with our own effort. And the thing about that is it accesses a kind of moral resource that people don't confuse the cause you're trying to build with your own personal benefit, and are much more willing to contribute and much more willing to help, because it's a kind of leadership by example. Now, of course, you can't sustain it forever, obviously, and not everybody can, but there are moments that require extraordinary sacrifice in order to make change. I think it's just the reality of it, and I'm not advocating that you go do that. But you know, as you reflect on these things, you have to, if the status quo always has a preponderance of the resources, And if you think you can, in order to make change, it's kind of like I was saying before about the story I told. You have to figure out how to compensate for resources you don't have with greater resourcefulness and greater commitment. And it's, I just think it's how it is.
Yeah, just two related questions for this. Two related questions. One, you never worried about your future. You know, everyone always like every of us tries to build a career and to make some saving. This one question. And the second question, the states has a lot of resources, so I think people were lucky enough to, to fund these organizations by themselves. In countries like, let's say, African countries, where they don't have, like, they are very poor, they don't have resources, they don't have sometimes water or food. How do you think these organizations will fund themselves? Thank you very much.
I don't want to speak outside my experience, but I think there is a big difference between discovering your calling and planning your career. And I was blessed with finding a calling. That is something I wanted to do with my life early on. And the sort of, for me, what happened was the steps unfolded. I never thought I was going to be a Harvard professor. And that wasn't my plan. What I wanted to do was work to make social change, civil rights, farm workers, and so forth. And then I had a real appetite for trying to study and understand more deeply and then to teach it. And as I say, I've been fortunate to find the career path for acting on that calling. I think the most important thing for us is to discover what we're called to do. Because the interesting thing is when we pursue a pathway passionately, we are more creative, we are better at it, and my experience has been we attract other people and the resources with which to do it. I've seen it happen again and again. And when we're doing work that's dissonant with our deepest values, that we feel like we're fighting ourselves all the time, we underperform, we turn others away, we become frustrated. So I think it's not, again, there's a practical dimension to this. In terms of the resources in the States, I mean, I think one of the most inspiring social movements for social change in the 20th century was Gandhi's movement in India. Gandhi's teaching of nonviolence and how nonviolence unfolded so over many years of struggle, but ultimately successfully, taught the whole world a way to make change. And that came not from the wealthy North America, it came from India. And it traveled from India to Africa in the 1950s, where many of the liberation struggles were pursued nonviolently. It traveled to the United States, where it became the way the civil rights movement made its stride. Traveled to California, where I was involved with the farm workers. Traveled to Poland, Eastern Europe, in solidarity. So I don't know. I think circumstances and contexts vary, of course, but so does our capacity to be creative, and so do the moral resources on which we can draw for the sacrifice and commitment it takes to make change.
On your five elements, I think, and reflecting on the mayor's sense that if there is something lacking, it might be that the sense of hope. I do agree with it. And I think where we are stuck is with the first element, the story. Yes, we are a community of storytellers. But if you listen to the stories, you will find that mostly stories about the past, not stories about the future. And the question is, how do we articulate a story about the future that strikes the imagination of people, that gets their creativity and juices and enthusiasm going, so that they apply themselves at their best, so that story is missing. And I think the four other elements are there.
Yeah.
We don't, everything is there, but the story is really missing. And I really like that we started with it and we emphasized it. And we are good at telling them. We just have to together, and maybe that is a collective action, to come up with a story that, because there were times when there was a story that invigorated communities. I don't think we have.
I think that often the resources for a story of the future is often rooted in traditions of the past, but it's values that the stories of the past contribute. The vision that's required lies in the future. And I guess I'm tempted to ask the people who participated in the workshop on storytelling to comment on this, because this is exactly what we were working on. I mean, that's exactly what we were working on, was what we call a story of self. Why am I called to this cause? Why are we called, and what is the source of hope upon which we can call? Just before that, I want to say one other thing. In our country, the Democratic Party was stuck without a story of hope for years. When Obama gave his speech in 2004 that brought him to national attention, called The Audacity of Hope, I was working on writing a paper at the time on asking why did the Democrats keep nominating stiffs. Now, a stiff, I'm not quite sure how to translate, that's like a dead person. In other words, we had candidate after candidate who were morally and emotionally inarticulate, could not speak it. And Obama's gift was to be able to reach back into those sources of hopefulness and build on the past to lift a forward vision. And that's what inspired so many young people, and then that became a critical resource. So I think you find the answer in doing it. And so I don't know, I wonder, could anybody from the workshop like to comment on that? Not to put you on the spot, so I?
It was a very powerful practice, because when we were practicing our stories of self, of us and now, we were in groups. And we needed first to answer the question, what in your life brought you to this workshop? And so you really needed to dig into the significant and the critical in your life that really brought you again to a moment where you need to explore further your relationship with community. So that was the past, but us in it. Then we listened to each other's stories of self, and by listening to each one tell their own story of self, we had to sit and work on the relationship, that civic relationship that will align us into a shared purpose. And in that moment, we were requested to work on the story of us. And in that story, we had to retell a bit of us, but a bit of self, but a lot of us. So we also needed to really listen to everyone, but at the same time identify the shared challenge that we have and the shared purpose we are trying to move forward. After that, we had to work to create a team. And we really had to negotiate in that team, what is this all about? To be able to reach the moment of now. And that is to connect with the urgency of why now mobilize for action. So the now, although it was called upon in the present and pressed why act now, it was actually mobilizing for the future. But in every moment, there was a recognition of the selves in the group, the us's in the group, the urgency of action now for the future.
I think what I'd add to that is that what really struck me in the workshop was how big a source of hope all the other people in the workshop were for every participant. It was as if people were in their islands. But by bringing people together to actually listen to each other and what it was that was motivating them and what they were hoping for, it turned out that people were not so isolated. And it lays a foundation for collaboration. And that sense of solidarity, community, love, whatever you want to call it, becomes an important resource in terms of facing the future in a different kind of way. I was really struck with the way that happened. I mean, the reality is that probably everyone in this room has had in their own life a story of pain. Otherwise, they wouldn't think change was needed. But also a story of hope, or else they wouldn't think they could make that change. And it's figuring out how to harness those sources of hope that daily move us forward and turn them into something we can share as an underpinning for a vision of how to move forward. And I think I was very inspired by working these last 4 days here with people from this community, and I think that